Welcome to a special episode, a regular episode, a bonus episode, whatever, of Homebrew History. It is your host, Joseph Ricky, and you will notice, dear listener or dear viewer, already you have seen, Bo is not by my side. Bo is on other duties as assigned for tonight. We've had a little special recording, had to flex things in the schedule, and it ended up being someone's birthday, and he has to make a big deal about his birthday. So we are joined tonight by Kevin Levin. Kevin is the author and just incredible writer on his own Substack, Civil War Memory, which I have been subscribed to now for, I mean, I was on there when it was this CW Memory, a long time ago. So it's been at least maybe 8 or so years that I've been reading what Kevin's put out there. He is also the author of, I think, one of the most brilliantly named books ever, Searching for Black Confederates, the Civil War's Most Persistent Myth. And it is a delight to finally get Kevin on Homebrew History.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah. And so what I thought we'd talk about tonight is just a little bit about Civil War memory in general and kind of roll through a little bit of the work that you do and where Civil War historians, we're public Civil War historians, academic Civil War historians, where we find ourselves these days. But I want to go back and just a little bit, when I first started reading from your blog and started picking up little bits and pieces of the nuggets that Kevin has been dropping for so long, I was reading it from a very different perspective, maybe than I have. And I want to be very honest, and I think this is great that this character development is what we call this. But, when I first started reading your blog, Kevin, I was still involved in the Civil War living history community and Civil War roundtable communities, which always said things like, you got to watch that Levin, he's a revisionist, he's this, that, he's woke, back when it actually again, this shows how long I've been reading. You were still politically correct.
That's right. That's right.
right. So now it's woke. Now it's so. What's fun about this is the more and more I read, the more I was like, actually, I think you guys are just wrong. I think Kevin might be onto something here. And it's it's amazing.
Good to hear.
No, right?
Yeah.
So I do want to be honest with you. When I first started reading, it was like, I gotta see what this guy is up to. And then it very quickly became, well, actually, he's right. So when you get out of that echo chamber, you get out of there. So I guess my first question to you is, when your readership is, maybe that's not where I want to go, is how do you think that we bridge that gap, right? How do you bridge that gap? Because there's little pockets of Civil War history enthusiasts, right? There's the guy that watches Ken Burns and can quote Shelby Foote with the rabbit and the mare story and all that right off the bat, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the academic, right? And we both know Scott. You've met Scott Bumpus, Gettysburg, and I've known Scott for a couple of years now. Scott and I, we can relate on so much because we kind of operated in the same circles, and now on the outside of those circles, it's like, whoa, wait a second.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that,
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to start off. I'm glad you're asking this question. I mean, when I started blogging in 2005, and at the time I was a full-time high school history teacher in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I had just finished a master's degree in history, and I had focused on the Civil War. I had finished a thesis on the Battle of the Crater and William Mahone, which eventually became my first book. And I was trying to figure out at that time, because I wasn't leaving teaching, I loved teaching, but I also had this really deep interest in Civil War history and specifically the study of memory of the Civil War. And I was trying to figure out, well, how do I continue this? How do I continue to sort of not only feed my own interest in this stuff, but connect with other people? And so blogging had really just started to take off. I didn't know much about it, but I think I just one day decided, well, let's give this a shot and see what happens. And to make a long story short, within a relatively short period of time, I had sort of accumulated, I had sort of brought together a really interesting audience that I did not anticipate at all. On the one hand, I had a lot of, what you might call Civil War enthusiasts, people that we both know and relate to. I had, teachers that read my stuff. And
Mhm.
then the other part that was interesting was academic historians started reading my stuff. And that I was really sort of surprised by. And there were some really early readers. I mean, historians like Ken No, if you're in the Civil War historian field, the late Pete Carmichael, people like that who took an interest. And and as a result, I found it interesting to try to find ways of connecting people,
Mhm.
right? So in the comment section, people were talking to one another, and I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. On
Mhm.
top of that, I had people who were, you might call, sort of modern lost causers,
Mhm.
neo-Confederates, who, as you've already referred to, have taken sort of a negative view of my efforts,
Mhm.
which I find interesting for a number of reasons, and
Mhm.
perhaps we could talk about it. But I've always seen my role online, and especially my work beyond blogging, as trying to relate to different groups of people, trying to connect people whenever possible. We all have a shared interest in this history, and I
Mhm.
think we all stand to be able to learn something from one another. So it's been a fascinating journey, one that
Mhm.
I did not anticipate. 20 years ago, I mean, this coming November will be 20 years of writing my blog, Civil War Memory. It's been a wild ride.
And now it's migrated to Substack, but that doesn't take away the
Yeah,
quality or anything, right? Uh,
it's same thing, really. I mean, it's just different platform.
yeah. So I guess let's dive into, because you kind of you broached it. We teased it a little bit. Is
Hmm.
you know, and I guess full transparency. Most listeners know this, but if you happen to come across this for the first time, I likewise spent a lot of time in the Civil War field. I'm a public historian. I worked at the Battle of Franklin Trust,
Hmm.
organization that has taken its fair share of flack for talking about slavery, mentioning,
Yeah,
the causes of the war, talking about the lost cause, talking about monuments and
yeah.
memory and the myth of reconciliation. So full
Hmm.
transparency, right? I've got a folder of emails that's like this thick. There's nothing compared. I was only there for 3 years. That's nothing compared to, like, say, Eric, right? Who's got filing cabinets full of,
Poor
hey,
guy. Hey, poor guy. Yeah.
but like, how do what do you say? What do you think when you're on the receiving end of these? We'll call them attacks.
Hmm.
Attack on intellect, attack on interpretation, but then too sometimes they're kind of personal attacks. I can't
Oh
tell you
yeah.
how many times I've been called, X, Y, and Z, right? But it's not just like let's badmouth people, but you know, if you're out there, you're working, you're trying to get people to come to an understanding
Yeah.
with arguably the most defining moment in the history of the country, certainly of the 19th century.
Yeah.
You have to be honest about it, and all of a sudden
Yeah.
you're being confronted with the longest, most difficult obstruction in history. How do you
Yeah.
do it?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I would say is that when I look back on my interactions over the last 20 years, I have to say the vast majority have been positive, right?
Right.
I mean, obviously the negative ones stand out. And I also have a long, email archive that goes back all the way. And, on occasion, I will sort of, just old time's sake, right? Sort of go
Yeah.
through it, pick out my top 10 list, if you will. Maybe I'll do something like that for the 20th anniversary of my
Oh, that'd be
of my
good.
blog. I think a lot of people would enjoy that. But I think those moments, that you're describing that we've all experienced, I think those are moments where I that reflect they reflect a number of things. One of the things that it reflects is the fact that there are people out there who take a very personal interest. There's a very deep personal investment in
Mhm.
this history. And that could be for any number of reasons.
Mhm.
But overall, I think it's because their preferred narrative of the Civil War era reinforces or feeds something about how they see the world today. It might be a very direct connection to current politics, right? There are plenty of examples of that.
Mhm.
Um, and quite often, it might be because that individual has an ancestor who fought for the Confederacy, or there's some other connection to that period of time. And I think, when I'm writing online, and I should say I used to hear from those people a lot more,
Mhm.
5 years ago and back than I do now. But when
Mhm.
I would hear from them, I would try to be as understanding as possible. As long as you are respectful, I will engage.
Mhm.
Um, Once you sort of move beyond that, obviously game is over. But I always try to remember that, they're coming at this from a perspective that, again, I could learn something from. Maybe not content related, but just in
Mhm.
terms of, one's attitude toward the past, which I find really interesting as someone who studies, memory of the war.
Mhm.
Um, and and so, yeah, I mean, those can be very uncomfortable moments. But again, they sort of pale in comparison to the positive interactions.
Mhm.
And you know, there is no other event in our history like the Civil War, in the sense that, it is, it is very much our felt history, right?
Mhm.
And that manifests itself in so many different ways.
Mhm.
And it's still with us in many ways. I mean, I think it's changed over time, given each generation, and the further we are removed from that history. But yeah, there are still people out there who are deeply invested in it.
Mhm. And I think that's the thing that always struck me in my dealings with the public when you never know who's going to show up and take a tour, right? So you're
Yeah,
talking and you're giving family background, you talk a little bit, and all of a sudden you're ready to start talking about getting us geared towards the war, and you say, by 1860 the Carters were here and there were
yeah,
28 enslaved men, women, and children here.
right.
You can see, if you're skilled and quick enough, you can see the room,
Yeah,
and you
you can
can
read it.
feel the change
Yeah,
very, very quickly.
that's right.
And it doesn't I don't think it always comes from a place of malice, and I don't think it always comes from a place of, "Oh, I gotta listen to this." Sometimes it comes from, "I'm uncomfortable with this conversation because what I don't want is to be, chastised for the actions of people 160 years ago,"
Yeah,
which
right.
is fair. I mean, that's fair to say, right?
Yep.
But then the other part of it is, I don't want to hear about how this is my fault or anything like that, right? And then the other piece of it, I think, is the uncomfortability.
Yeah.
Uh, and this is a conversation that I've seen you have on the Civil War memory. I've seen you mentioned him, so I'll bring him back up. The
Hmm.
late great Pete Carmichael talk about difficulty in modern times talking about race in the 19th
Hmm. Yeah.
and talking about it today. It becomes an uncomfortable conversation, but I think that's part of the necessary bit of learning, and certainly the necessary bit of interpretation is the uncomfortable part.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think you've sort of you've nailed it. And I've seen people. I've seen that level of discomfort, or that, I've experienced that discomfort with others. And again, it comes in different ways. I think sometimes it's as innocent as, well, I've always thought about the Civil War as, the war of the common soldier, right? In other words, something along that, reconciliationist
Mhm.
narrative that, has us think of, remember and commemorate the war as simply a war between soldiers on both sides who fought bravely, but we're not
Mhm.
going to sort of delve into the respective causes for which they
Mhm.
fought. Sometimes it is, as you pointed out, that feeling of personal responsibility. Um, I've never really quite understood that. I think one can, acknowledge a sense of responsibility, simply as you are part of a nation that's whose history includes the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow, and as a member of a nation with a history, you have to take some ownership. What that means, of course, is something worth discussing. I mean, one of the things my wife likes to say to me, she's from Germany, and she noticed this very early on as I was taking her to some of these historic sites, and at one point she commented that she said your country has no sense of collective shame, right? So there's a comparative attitude between what she perceived here regarding Americans and their history, and back home in Germany, obviously thinking about World War II. So yeah, I mean, it is, when your collective memory is so deeply embedded in this notion of American exceptionalism, that we are the leader of the free world, that there is a natural progress towards greater freedom. We're always sort of freedom is always expanding, right? Right. We're never sort of taking a step back. Well, of course, when you acknowledge that history is more complex, that it is muddier, that is possible. You can take a step forward and 2-3 steps back. That can get very uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
And we're seeing that right now. I mean, that is essentially, in my mind, that sort of encapsulates the kind of politicization of history that we're seeing right now. Whether it's how we teach, or how we should celebrate the 250th birthday of the United States, which is, as you know, ongoing.
Yeah, and I think you kind of alluded to this a minute ago, and I meant to bring it up then, but you talked about how the Civil War gives us our first it's our felt history, our collective memory, right? And then, to paraphrase Robert Penn Warren, it was this time, right, that as a nation we had some shared suffering.
Yeah.
But out of that suffering, I would always say that, out of the suffering, 750,000 men die. The nation is saved, slavery is abolished, and very quickly, within a 5-year period, we see 3 amendments to the Constitution, 13, 14, and 15, that abolish slavery, and by 1870, 5 years, extend voting rights to Black men.
Yeah.
Which is an incredible leap forward.
Right. No one would have anticipated that in 1860. Right.
And then all of a sudden, we end Reconstruction. And I think, really, we talk about problems with Civil War memory. How much of the problems with understanding the Civil War and thinking about it in our day-to-day life go back to Reconstruction even?
Sure. Oh, I think a lot of it. What you were just saying about sort of the radical change that took place between the beginning of the war, and not just the end of the war, but then moving, of course, into the post-war period. Go to 1870, obviously, again, the 15th Amendment, but take a couple of years back to 1858 and Dred Scott, right? I mean, the Supreme Court declares that African Americans can never be citizens, right? And of course, 10 years later, 12 years later, we see that change. It's interesting because we've already sort of talked about this kind of the sense of the Civil War as our felt history, as sort of geared toward that lost cause that people are deeply invested in this history because it's a relative or whatever it is, that personal connection. But I find in the last few years that there is another kind of distortion of the Civil War era, and it comes from the opposite side of the spectrum, if you will. And I think it's the failure to acknowledge change over time, right? I think Americans right now are just, many Americans, I should say, not all certainly, are, experiencing a sense of doom and gloom right now. And with all of the recent news, especially on the racial front, over the last few years, I think it can seem to some people that, well, nothing has changed in the end, that we are, as I hear all the time, and it drives me nuts, that we are still, quote unquote, fighting the Civil War, right? That Reconstruction was a complete failure, that nothing good came of it, that it was inevitable that it would fail, right? All of these are a kind of, self-serving narrative that we deploy to explain the present. But
Mhm.
I think, like The Lost Cause, it doesn't really identify, acknowledge again the complexity of that time period. And I
Right.
think that is the struggle that's as a historian, as an educator, I confront all the time. That on the one hand, people certainly need a useful past, a past that helps them get through the day, if you will, and explain what's happening. That's a natural urge, I think. And at the
Mhm.
same time, I think it's that at the same time, I think we need to remind people that that's not necessarily a a what you might describe as a critical examination of history. That's
Mhm.
not what historians are doing when they're doing history, right?
Mhm.
And so I think there's often we're often talking past one another.
Mhm.
At least when I'm talking to people online on social media, trying to get them to take that next step.
Mhm.
And that's another place where you can end up having very unpleasant conversations.
Mhm. I feel like the social media front of history and the public history of history can kind of almost meld with one another because
Yeah.
you see a lot of the same interactions, right? There's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
us, I don't want to hear this. I don't, you don't know what you're talking about, which
Yeah.
is crazy, crazy audacity to have in front of a group of 20 people to just be like, I clearly know more than you do, you idiot. And that's being nice. But, the idea that Reconstruction failed totally, right? I think completely disregards the work of Reconstruction.
Yeah.
I would say, to the person that says we're still fighting the Civil War, I would say no. I think we're finishing Reconstruction. We're continuing Reconstruction. And one of the things I used to tell groups was, you don't get to the modern civil rights movement of the 1960s without going through the first civil rights movement of the 1860s. You have to have that, but it doesn't mean that it works, right? The Civil Rights Bill of 1875 is crushed by Jim Crow.
Yeah.
But even then, there's still voices of protest that come out from
It,
from the
it
Reconstruction on.
yeah, it never stops, right? I mean, because that's the narrative that, if you did pay attention in your high school history class, that's the narrative you learn, that somehow Reconstruction ends, Jim Crow takes over, and it's kind of like the Dark Ages, right?
Mhm.
Until you get to Brown v. Board of Ed or something in the mid
Yeah,
1950s, right?
right.
Well, if you actually do, open the hood and look under, right, you're going to see a great deal of civil rights protest right through that period. I mean, one of
Mhm.
my favorite speeches by Frederick Douglass is a speech that he gave within a few months of his death in 1895, and he was helping to dedicate a new black school in Manassas, of all places, the site of two major Civil War battles. And at one point, it's a wonderful speech to read. And at one point, he's got students in front of him and teachers and the broader black community, and he looks at the kids and he's like, well, you probably wondering, what is my advice for you? How should I see the future? Here you are, these, students, you still have your lives ahead of you. What does it look like for us, right? What should we be looking for? What will our lives turn out to be? And he's very, very positive. He's like, this is the best time to be alive right now. Now,
Mhm.
you might be surprised by that because it's 1895. And for a lot of people by that point in time, everything has shut down, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, at least in that general area of time. And that's not Douglas's attitude. And so I guess it's also a reminder that we do need to, look at how people experience the world from their viewpoint,
Mhm.
right? Rather than knowing how the broader story turns out from
Mhm.
our perspective, our vantage point. And
Mhm.
I think that when you do that, you find a much more dynamic kind of story
Mhm.
that you can tell. Because of course, no one knows what's going to happen tomorrow, no more than we do right now.
Mhm.
Take any major issue that we're confronting right now, and no one knows how it's going to turn out tomorrow or the next week or the next month. And it's, I think, sometimes worth acknowledging that fact in the people that we study in the past.
Mhm. And one of the things I appreciate about your writing and the work of so many of our more modern scholars is that they're taking that approach of trying to place people within the context of the time that they lived. But there's a propensity really in the kind of the popular culture,
Yeah.
the everyday reader. They want to kind of look back with the hindsight of 150, 160 years and talk about how Reconstruction either failed
Yeah.
or how Reconstruction was so oppressive and so appalling.
Yeah.
And there's never the middle ground that talks about, what did the soldier who was in the 65th Pennsylvania, what did he think about when he went home and it was 1872 and people were already starting to forget the war and put it behind them, and
Yeah.
there's an economic panic coming the next year, but he might not ever
Yeah.
realize that in the moment, and then all of a sudden it's 1880 and he's going into a soldier's home because he can't cope with what he experienced. And people would ask, what did you even do? You won the war, but you couldn't win the peace.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I love about Brian Jordan's book, Marching
Mm.
Forward, where he talks about these men sat around with empty sleeves and stood at the base of monuments dedicated to their regiments, and
Yeah.
none of them to their generals, none of them to the cause, the preservation of the Union or emancipation or anything. And you could ask, what did you even fight for? In the same way that nobody ever bothers to ask what a formerly enslaved person now living in freedom is thinking throughout the
Yeah.
1870s and 18, and that it seems like there's this big, almost a big gap, right smack in the middle of
Yeah.
our thinking about the Civil War.
It speaks to this, there's always this, if I'm following what you're getting at here, there's always this sort of tension between, on the one hand, wanting to say something, wanting to create some level of synthesis,
Hmm.
coming out of your research, right? In other
Hmm.
words, if you're studying, say, for example, as you mentioned, Civil War soldiers, I mean, as you well know, there's a real deep body of really good scholarship
Hmm.
about Civil War soldiers, and it tends to take the approach of, you have a couple questions you're going to pose to the evidence, and what do? We look at diaries, we look at letters, and we sort of pick and choose, what comes out of it, and we try to sort of create some kind of coherent narrative.
Hmm.
And then at the same time, of course, you have to acknowledge that, when you look at the individual, right? That's a very different experience over the course of the war.
Hmm.
What he experienced, and then certainly, as scholars have increasingly shown over the last few years, their post-war experiences, which are, so dramatically different. Where you live after the war, you know, um, your political affiliation,
Hmm.
whether you are disabled, physically or psychologically, or perhaps both, your race, right? The
Hmm.
experience of a Black Civil War veteran is very different from a white Civil War veteran for obvious reasons.
Hmm.
Also, being able to land a pension, once pensions become available. So, I mean, the individual experience it's always, I think, helpful to. I'll give you an example. I am editing a collection of letters from a South Carolinian named John Winsmith. He was a captain and diehard Confederate, uh, on the eve of the war and right through the war. His letters go right through September 1864. And this guy brought like 3 or 4 body servants with him into the army. He is committed to slavery from beginning to end, as was his father. In fact, his father was serving in the South Carolina Assembly and actually proposed the resolution for secession. So this is, I mean, they are diehard through and through.
Hmm. Hmm.
During Reconstruction, both the father and son become radical Republicans. I mean, it is. I'm still trying to figure out how to explain this
Yeah.
transition. But when you follow one individual through this incredible time period, there is so there is so much more to confront as a historian, because you're really sort of trying to understand, um, how an individual life, experiences, how a
Hmm.
specific person experiences such dramatic events, right?
Hmm.
and how they are impacting events are impacting them. I mean, it is a whole different ball game. And so yeah, I mean, there is so much to write about when it comes to this time
Mhm.
period, and also because it's so relevant to today. And I think that gets us back to the fact that for a lot of people, you know, looking back on, who are not necessarily students of history or obviously historians, but who are aware of the past,
Mhm.
they want something that is going to be useful, right? They want something that is going to explain what's happening right now,
Mhm.
to make that bigger connection.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, it's all kinds of challenges.
Yeah. So we're going to take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, more with Kevin Levin on Civil War memory, and we'll be right back with these few little advertisements and some plugs for the show too. Did you know that Homebrew History is brought to you by Civil War Trails, the world's largest outdoor museum? You can trek the battlefields of Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and now Tennessee. Get out there and make some history of your own. Snap a picture with a sign, use that hashtag sign selfie, and make sure you tag Civil War Trails to help spread the word about their work and all of the help that they give those budding interests in the Civil War, help them to get inspired by knowing where they are. Homebrew History now airs weekly. We are a weekly podcast. Once more, back in the saddle, Bo and I will be bringing in guests like the guest you're listening to currently, and we'll try and keep the topics flowing and keep things, as always, a little bit of a variety. If you want to support Homebrew History, the best way to do it, go to Buy Me a Coffee. You'll find the link for that down below. That helps us to continue show costs and helps keep Bo and I where we can get out to guests and try and make a way for this show to keep on moving. And finally, if you want to pick up some really, really great Civil War pop culture inspired stickers and merchandise, t shirts and hats, check out The Bearded Historian. I think he's even got a great new Gary Edelman of the American Battlefield Trust with multiple hands gesticulating wildly. And I think there's even a selfie stick on that one. But be sure to check out all of Jeff Williams's great work. And you can also find a link to Jeff's shop down below us in the comment section or in the description of this video. But we will be right back. We are back with Kevin Levin of Civil War Memory. You can find Kevin on Substack, and you can pick up his books. Now there's another one on the way, right? Because we've got the Robert Gould Shaw biography on the way.
Hopefully early next year. Yeah.
Oh, amazing, amazing. And I wanted to pick your brain about that a little bit because
Awesome. Yeah.
how do you write about Matthew Broderick, right?
Right. Right. No, it's. I mean, there's a wonderful. I've posted this on my blog a couple times, but there's a wonderful side by side of Matthew Broderick and Robert Gould Shaw, and man, they do really look alike.
Mhm,
They nailed it. They really
mhm.
did.
So how do you approach the story that has been so kind of encapsulated in a movie, really? Because I think that's a lot of people's first exposure
Yeah.
to United States colored troops and their service during the war is the film,
Yeah.
which, let's be very straightforward, is an excellent film.
It's the best.
But
Yeah.
how do you separate the man in the movie from the man in reality? And I feel like that has to be a challenge when you consider the way that he's melded into the story of the 54th Massachusetts is very different maybe than his upbringing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the movie. What's so fascinating? The movie doesn't. I mean, the movie alludes to his upbringing. I mean, obviously, some of those early scenes, especially when he's back home and receives word that he's been offered the command of the 54th. Of course, Shaw was actually in Virginia in camp. His father came down to notify him that the governor, was going to make him an offer. And so you get a sense of his upper class background in Boston, although the family had moved, by that time. They lived in Staten Island. Um, but it's so the movie gets that part right. But I mean, look, Hollywood has its own agenda when it comes to making movies that are set in history, and that agenda rarely includes the kind of commitment to the truth as historians understand it.
Mhm.
And I understand that. I accept that. In fact, I don't watch, movies about history,
Hmm.
because I'm interested in history. I watch those movies because I hope they're entertaining,
Right.
and they might inspire you to read history. But I had moved to Boston in 2011. I've been living in Virginia since 2000, and so all of my research was really centered on Virginia and the Confederacy. I was just fascinated with all of it. And, I had to finish my Black Confederates book after I moved here, but I was already, I mean, moving to Boston, of course, you are surrounded by a very rich history. And so I, you know, decided fairly early on that my next big project was going to be something more locally rooted. And Shaw just seemed the perfect subject because, again, as someone who's interested in memory, I
Hmm.
can sort of use glory as a point of departure, because as you rightly point out, I mean, for a lot of people, that is what they know. That might be the only thing they know about the 54th and Robert Gould Shaw. And so, writing a full-length biography gave me the opportunity to really flesh out that story. And one of the things I was really interested in doing is trying to understand Shaw's earlier military career, because I think most people, when they think of Shaw, they think of the 54th, but Shaw was only in command of black soldiers from roughly February 1st until July 18th. What, roughly 6 months? But
Hmm.
he had been in the army since the spring of 1861, and so I was really interested in how that earlier experience in Virginia, mainly in the Shenandoah Valley, and then further east, how that experience early on shaped his understanding of, what it means to command soldiers,
Hmm.
and also, of course, his evolving understanding of emancipation and race.
Hmm.
It seemed to me only, if you have to sort of come to terms with that earlier history if you're going to understand anything about his last 6 months in command before his death at, leading his troops at Battery Wagner on July 18th, 63.
Well, I know that there's a whole band of listeners, and I know Bo and I are both excited about it. I've been following along with you since you announced that that's what you were working on. But
Appreciate
it's
it.
he's one of those stories of the war where you see his picture. He's immortalized in bronze in Boston, but you don't necessarily feel him, right? He's this kind of. It's almost.
Yeah.
I don't want to make the comparison to Joshua Chamberlain because it's too easy.
Yeah.
But it feels like he's in this great pantheon that you can't quite understand him in the way that you could understand, say, maybe a William Carney. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's certainly true. Look, it helps. It helps to die right in the middle of the war,
Right.
commanding soldiers on the battlefield. And just as important, it helps to have a mother who was absolutely committed to memorializing her son after
Mhm.
his death
Mhm.
almost immediately.
Mhm.
And so, when you appreciate that, um, his memory, the memory story begins to make sense. But it also helps you to realize that there's something quite distorted about this picture because, and I think glory contributes this to a certain extent, but I think there is something, and I think the problem is that glory um, has to compress the story in certain
Mhm.
respects. So by the end of Glory, Shaw has become fully committed to his mission. He has died, um, carrying out the mission that he had always been intended to assume or
Mhm.
lead, right? Namely, black soldiers in the cause of emancipation. At the end of Glory, you see Augustus St. Gaudens's beautiful relief statue that's in Boston, here in Boston, and the text, the narrative, something along the lines of that the attack at Wagner sort of solidified the place of black soldiers and Shaw and all of that. And Shaw certainly evolved in his understanding of race and the men under his command, but not to that extent. And I think
Mhm.
what Glory has done is it has pushed other officers away from being more fully recognized.
Mhm.
In other words, I mean, take one example, wonderful new biography of Thomas Wentworth Higginson just
Mhm.
came out.
Mhm.
Higginson is really he's the real deal. I mean,
Mhm.
full abolitionist before the Civil War, had aligned himself with John Brown.
Mhm.
Here in Boston, had rescued or attempted to rescue fugitive slaves who were being arrested and forced back into slavery. Um, he was down in South Carolina, commanding the Second South Carolina
Mhm.
Volunteers, one of the first black regiments raised down there. No one knows about Higginson, or
Mhm.
even James Montgomery, who
Mhm.
is featured in Glory. But
Yeah.
Montgomery's portrayal in Glory is the villain,
Right.
right? And go to the famous burning of Darien.
Right.
When you read Shaw's letters, he had a much more complicated understanding of James Montgomery and actually admired him quite a bit.
Mhm.
But Montgomery, of course, is in the mid 1850s fighting against slavery on the Kansas frontier.
Mhm.
No one knows who Montgomery is apart from the portrayal in Glory. So
Mhm.
it seems to me that Shaw gets a bit more recognition in this regard than he deserves.
Mhm.
And I think that one of the things I try to do with the biography is by slowing it down and by sort of really trying to nail down where Shaw was on race and slavery and commanding black soldiers,
Mhm.
I think it does help us get back to one of your earlier points here tonight, which is that the few people could have anticipated in 1860-61 where the war would end up,
Mhm.
even by 1863. Remember, the war doesn't have to. The war the war could have ended with slavery still intact.
Mhm.
If the war had ended before the end of 1862, the Union is saved. That gives Lincoln and the vast majority of the loyal white citizenry of the United States everything they had wanted.
Mhm.
And for Shaw specifically, that would have been enough,
Yeah.
right? But the
Yeah.
war
The
does
check the
continue,
box.
right?
Yep.
It's and that's what Shaw and so many other people were grappling with, trying to make sense of,
Mhm.
and their own place in all of that.
Mhm. And you can see that throughout the war too, with some of the bigger characters and bigger features, right? One thing, one of the kind of the last points we wanted to try and make with this conversation is, where do we see Civil War history? And I want to be really specific with
Mm,
this one: Civil War memory
yeah,
and the challenges that we face in understanding our war today. Because you kind of alluded to it, the
yeah,
politicization of history. When you get pictures of congressmen, congresswomen taking pictures on top of monuments and misidentifying them as the Wilder Monument, and talking about distorting the facts for their own kind of personal satisfaction, and to really glom on to maybe the least common denominator.
yeah,
What do we do as historians and as readers of history,
yeah,
and those of us who are in the field? Because it certainly seems as though this is a challenging time.
yeah,
And it's not just, I'm not just saying this because of today, right? It's not just
yeah,
2025. This has been a problem for a decade, if not more, of this issue with reckoning with the war, reckoning with slavery,
yeah,
discussing race, reckoning with race, and
yeah.
trying to find ways to have a conversation about the Civil War that doesn't end up with one side trying to refight it and the other side trying to refight it.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I guess I would push back a little, only in the sense of I don't think that what we're experiencing today, in regard to the contested nature of history, and
Mhm.
specifically the Civil War era, is really any. I mean, certainly it's evolved in certain ways,
Mhm.
but I don't see it. We've always
Yeah, it's
sort
not
of
new.
struggled with it. It's not new,
Right.
right? In fact, I think what I find encouraging is, that you don't have to go that far back to
Mhm.
find, a still a very vibrant lost cause narrative that still appealed to politicians on both sides of the
Mhm.
aisle, right?
Mhm.
You go back
Mhm.
to the 1990s and
Yeah.
1980s. I mean, the lost cause, especially in the South, was still very much a kind of regional narrative. I
Mhm.
think that that has changed dramatically
Oh yeah,
over
yeah,
the last 10, 15 years.
yeah.
And I think, it helps to explain why even in places like Richmond, there are no monuments anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about not being able to anticipate change. I mean,
Mhm.
I wrote a piece in 2017 for Smithsonian, I think it was, yeah, 16, 17, in which I said, I was basically making the argument that Richmond has done a really good job of expanding its monument landscape,
Mhm.
and that, it serves as a model for other cities, kind of making the case that perhaps there was a way of
Mhm.
um, continuing the status quo when it comes to the Confederate monuments.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, come
Hopefully
2000,
3-4 years
2020,
later.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. They're pretty much all gone. And even in places like Charlottesville, Baltimore, New Orleans.
Mhm.
So the political leverage
Mhm.
that lost causers once had, right? I mean, in Virginia right now, the governor may actually accept a bill from the assembly that denies Confederate heritage groups tax exempt status for the first time. So there's another example.
Mhm.
He vetoed it last year. But it again, it just helps make the point that, what was once the dominant narrative that
Mhm.
had, again, political leverage is
Mhm.
just, I think, blown out of the water.
Mhm.
What's taking its place, I'm not quite sure. I mean,
Mhm.
certainly there's a kind of a neo-emancipationist narrative that reduces, or I think, or wants to reduce the war to the issue of slavery. And on the one hand, that is very much a corrective to the lost cause, right?
Mhm.
And
But it almost becomes an overcorrective without
it could, right?
acknowledging. Yeah.
It could. I mean, on the one hand, it's refreshing, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think it I think it puts us in a position where we're not able to appreciate the complexity of what Northerners, or what, the citizenry of the loyal citizenry of the United
Mhm.
States was actually fighting for, and the evolution of the war, as we've already talked about.
Just a
I think
few
it
weeks
makes it more
ago,
difficult to understand that.
you had a great post a few weeks ago about the Union War, right? And you quoted a little bit from Gary Gallagher, and you used some primary source material here and there.
Yeah,
And what jumped out to me is, for listeners of the show, and I'm sure you've seen a little bit here and there, I've researched an Indiana state senator who goes on in the war, becomes a general. I've been with George Wagner for a decade now. And
uh,
what's amazing is there's no primary source material that he leaves behind. There's no diary, no journal. He has no memoir. He never lives long enough to write it. But what you see from him is a man who, you point out in that piece, is dedicated to the country.
yeah,
He's dedicated to the idea of
yeah,
union, and some of that comes from cultural heritage, right? He's a
yeah,
second generation German American. His father had immigrated to the United States for stability and to be part of a union, to be part of a country. And now all of a sudden in 1860 and 61, there's this this tear, the
yeah,
sexual tension has broken the back of the nation, and you get men like George Wagner, like an Emerson Updike, like a Ulysses S. Grant, like a Robert Gould Shaw, that
yep,
say, no, you don't just get to do that. You
yeah,
don't just get to leave. So
yeah,
they might start in 1860, 61 with
yeah,
that mindset.
yep.
But by 1863, 64, their mindset has changed, and now it's no longer just preservation of the Union, it's also ending slavery, understanding, like Lincoln and like Douglas had said,
Yeah.
you can't have one without the other.
I think 2 points. I agree with everything you just said. 2 points. I think Gallagher is right that we don't really have a concept of union in
Mhm,
2025. That
mhm,
the
mhm,
challenge for us is to understand and appreciate what the union meant to the loyal citizenry of the United States, their connection to the revolutionary generation,
mhm.
especially in a place like where I live now, Boston, right? It
Right.
makes perfect sense. But I think your point about how the war evolves is also an important one, both because again, they couldn't anticipate the way the war would evolve, but understanding that even for those, Union soldiers and even many on the home front who embraced emancipation,
Mhm.
they embraced it because they believed it was the fastest way to reunite, to end the war and reunite the nation.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so understanding the kind of instrumental role that emancipation played also helps us to appreciate the struggles to come, because again, I think we run into a roadblock if we just assume that emancipation sort of dominates the thinking of the 1860s, right? Ending
Mhm.
slavery and equal rights. Then the next 100 years won't make any sense, because
Right.
that struggle won't make any sense. But if you understand that Americans in the 1860s created a nation, a revolution sort of creates a new nation, if you will, the Second American Revolution, as some historians sort of refer to it, uh, and it's one that they could not have anticipated,
Mhm.
right, or fully understood how that would play out, then I think it sort of humbles us a bit more, in the present moment, and sort of forces us to take a step back and say, okay, hold on here. How did that happen, right?
Mhm.
What were the consequences? How did Americans of various stripes try to make sense of it all
Mhm.
and go on from there, right?
Kevin, we're going to do two more segments here. We have a little word association to play and get your thoughts on this first picture.
So I have to choose one word, or can I just describe it?
You can describe it if you got
Well,
one word that works.
is it a furling flag or is it a rising flag, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Ah, yes, I know this one well. Agency. There's a one word answer. Agency.
Mhm. Explain, just for those who haven't picked up your book yet, what this image is.
Yeah, this is probably one of the most iconic photographs of the entire Civil War. This is a photograph of Andrew and Silas Chandler, Andrew the white man, and Silas, his body servant, or what I refer to in my book, Searching for Black Confederates, a camp slave.
Mhm.
And this photograph was likely taken in 1861 as the two were going off to war. Silas had been born enslaved to the Chandlers in Virginia before they moved to Mississippi, West Point, Mississippi, in the 1840s. And like a lot of Confederate officers from the slaveholding class, they would bring a body servant, as they would call them, into the army. They were attached legally to their owners. They were not a part of the Confederate military, and they would perform any kind of service job that their master, asked them or ordered them to do. Uh, the way to understand this photograph, in my mind, is that this is another example of the flexibility of slavery.
Mhm.
So slavery expands in various ways up to the Civil War. You think of it in terms of agriculture, you can think of it in terms of industry in certain parts of the South. And then once the war comes, slavery expands even more to become a resource for the
Mhm.
Confederate war effort. So when Alexander Stephens talks about slavery as the cornerstone of the Confederacy, he is talking about every aspect of the Confederacy, including the armies.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, that was, exactly what I would kind of have hoped, because without having the audio and the visual side, our listeners might just be a little confused. But uh, I would feel crazy doing Boohickey history without Bo. So instead, I'm just going to ask you, what's in your cup?
Oh, I'm going to really depress you, disappoint you, I should say, because it's just water right now. I'm dealing with
Ah,
some really bad allergies right now, so
yeah,
I apologize.
that's completely fair, because Bo's the one that can actually drink, right? He can still have a couple glasses every now. Not I. So it's green tea for me. Uh,
Good.
a Christmas mug, because tis the season. You know,
That's right. Always a season.
always, always. Kevin, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I want to thank you
My
for
pleasure.
joining us on Homebrew. I think this was a great discussion, kind of all over the place, but we got a chance to really dive into some of the kind of the ins and outs of what we face in the Civil War history world and our competition with memory. If listeners want to learn more, where can they go?
Yeah, as you've mentioned, I do run a Substack, a newsletter. Just, you can basically just go to any search engine and just, search for Civil War memory, and it should come up.
Awesome. And of course, the books are you've got your Petersburg book out there, but I think the one that everyone kind of runs straight to is Searching for Bought
Yeah,
Confederates, and very soon to be joined by a biography of Robert Gould Shaw.
yeah, hopefully.
Uh, Listeners, viewers, thank you for tuning in. Bo will be back next time if you couldn't stand listening to me and Kevin for 52 minutes. But we're going to go ahead and hit us with that end credit. Kevin, thanks for listening. Everyone else, cheers.
Thanks again.